Tonight we are thrilled to hear from distinguished Professor Robinson and her lecture titled Antarctica Biodiversity Under a Changing Climate. Welcome, Professor Robinson.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you, Professor Martin, for that wonderful introduction. And it's great to see so many old colleagues, new friends here tonight. And as Jenny said, really nice to see everyone coming out on such a wild and woolly night. It's almost Antarctic out there, although it's way too warm. So I'm going to talk about the research that we've been doing in Antarctica over the last 25 years. And it's actually a little bit scary for me standing up here and thinking that I've been doing this research for 25 years at Wollongong. But hopefully you'll enjoy the story as we go through that research. So I'd first like to start by thanking all the team members who've travelled to Antarctica with me and who've worked in the lab, because science is a team effort, and I'm standing up here talking to you, but really without all of these team members we wouldn't have this research. So many of the people featured here are actually in the audience, so welcome to all of you and thank you very much. But one thing I'd also like to emphasise is that environmental science tends to be quite a male-dominated area, and so it's actually quite unusual to have women working in this area, and particularly in the field sciences. Traditionally, it's been quite a male-dominated research top area. And so I'm really delighted to say that of the teams that I've taken to Antarctica, 80% of them have been female. So that diversity is a really important part of the research that we do, and I think it's really important to increase the number of women working in the field in Antarctica and in environmental science generally. So in 1996, when I went to Antarctica, we went on this lovely ship which unfortunately has been decommissioned. So this is the Aurora Australis. This took people down to Antarctica for many, many years and actually was retired about a year ago. And we had many interesting and somewhat exciting voyages when we were going to Antarctica, but this is one of the teams leaving Hobart, so you might see Mount Wellington in the background there. And the thing about going by ship to Antarctica is Hobart is nearly 4,000 kilometres from the stations that we go to, like Casey. And that's 4,000 kilometres across the Southern Ocean, one of the wildest oceans in the world, and the Roaring 40s and the 50s really do live up to their name. So often the waves crash right over the bridge. So if you look at how tall that ship is, there's waves that are just breaking over the top, and it's doing this. So most people get seasick. When you get over the seasick, though, the voyage is amazing because you get to see whales and amazing birds like albatrosses and seals and penguins. So here's one of the teams getting off the ship. So we then get off this big ship onto a smaller little boat and we move to the station. And in the very first season that I went down in 1996, I had my first helicopter ride. So the ship would park up about 100 kilometres from the station and we'd get airlifted off by helicopter and taken across the sea ice. And that's the most amazing experience, to be flying into a station over that sea ice and seeing how the sea ice develops as you move through. So that's an iceberg, obviously. They can be up to 4 kilometres long, and so you're actually flying over something that's really, really massive. And it's really difficult to do them justice with photographs because they could be little blocks of ice, but they're actually really massive. And I love sea ice because it breaks up into all these interesting patterns. So this is frazzle ice, but the sea ice forms different sorts of ice as it freezes and thaws, and you get all these really interesting patterns on the ice as you go through. And this image here shows us flying into Casey. So you might just be able to see some little boxes. That's one of the stations, Casey Station. All the Australian stations are like Lego. So each building this is actually Casey. So those little boxes, the red box is the accommodation building, the green box is where the food's kept, and so on. And they're all the same colour, so you can find them whichever station you're at. And these are the sorts of helicopters that we fly around in. So they're actually quite small, little squirrels and so on. And so those are the sorts of helicopters that you're flying off the ship and onto the land in. So getting to Antarctica has changed a lot in the 25 years. I had many interesting voyages on the Aurora, but now we actually fly in. And this is an image from the front of an Airbus 319. And pre-COVID, we were actually allowed up onto the flight deck. And this is a massive amount of sea ice with another iceberg, and again, several kilometres long. So just think about the scale of that as we're flying in. And this is the actual plane. So it's an Airbus 319. I'm sure lots of people have been on Airbus 319s or 320s. It's not anything special, but it lands on this ice runway that's been developed, graded outside of Casey Station, and the ice there is almost 2 kilometres thick. And they have to make the surface absolutely perfect for this wheeled plane to land on it in the summer. And there's another smaller plane there that can then transport people to other stations. So it goes from Wilkins Aerodrome near Casey to Davis and Mawson. And this is just a shout out for the alumni, because at Casey Station this summer, we had 3 people go from Antarctica working with me and my group, but there were 2 other UOW alums at Casey at the time. So one of the doctors was a UOW Graduate School of Medicine graduate, and we also had a PhD chemist from the atmospheric chemistry group. So it was great to actually share Casey Station this summer with so many UOW alumni. So Antarctica's a really tough place. It doesn't matter whether you're a plant or an explorer, it's pretty tough. And the picture down here is actually from Cape Denison, where Mawson's hut is, and it's one of the photographs that Frank Hurley took. Antarctica's the coldest, highest, driest, windiest continent. And it really lives up to its name in terms of the windiness. So this is members of that expedition that was there with Mawson going out to collect water, and the way you do that is to cut blocks of ice, bring them inside and melt them. And we still do the same thing. If we're at a field camp, that's how we get water. But in a blizzard, it's pretty unpleasant work. This is me standing on the balcony at Casey, and there's actually a sea, there should be blue sea out here, but when there's a blizzard, you can only see as far as your hand, if that, and you get totally disorientated. So it's a very, very scary, very weird feeling. Some days we have beautiful days, so that's a day where we might go boating. We might actually move around to the islands and the different peninsulas on small boats, on IRBs, inflatable boats. No wind, you can see how still the sea is. But often a blizzard will blow up, and this is clouds forming over Casey Station and a blizzard about to start. And then here's the view, that's the sea that should be out here. You can see that there is really a nice blue sky, and sometimes there's blue sky and blue sea to be seen. But even so, look at how many clothes we're wearing. So it's still pretty cold most of the time. So where we work is Casey Station, and it's one of Australia's 3 continental stations. So there's also Davis and Mawson. And we like to call it the Daintree of continental Antarctica. And we do that because it has some of the best moss on the whole continent. And that's why we actually go there, because we're interested in those plants, and it has some of the best vegetation. But there's a lot of the moss, but it's still not very many species, and it's relatively limited compared to, say, here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what grows at Casey and what grows in Antarctica generally. But this is one of those extensive moss beds that we've been working in now for the last 25 years. And you can see all that beautiful green moss and all the water that's helping to sustain it through the summer. So when we think about Antarctica, we usually think about penguins and seals. But I like to think about the animals and plants that can stay there through the winter. So these ones are the summer visitors. So Adelie penguins and seals of various kinds come in for the summer and they feed and breed, bring their young up, and then they leave again. They go off for the winter because it's too cold. There's those hardy emperor penguins that nest on the sea ice, and obviously they're there through the winter. And here's a picture of a huddle of poor little chicks all trying to stay warm while their feathers are covered in ice. But the real Antarcticans, the things that actually live on the land and stay there all year, are the mosses and the lichens. So these things are able to survive through the winter, and the winters even on the coast get down to -40 at least. So they're able to survive conditions that are twice as cold as your freezer. And they can do that because they're able to dry out and then freeze dry, and in that freeze-dried form, they can freeze down to really cold temperatures, actually much colder than -40, amazingly. And it's not just the mosses and lichens, the plants. There are also little animals inside the mosses. And so I like to think of the mosses as a forest full of very, very small animals. And this is a tardigrade on a moss leaf. So tiny, tiny microscopic animals. And the mosses are full of them. And there are more things, but tardigrades are quite cute. So if we look out the back of the red shed at KC, if we go outside, we can see a whole load of different vegetation. So there are cyanobacterial mats in the lake. There are algae that grow in the lake as well. There are mosses that grow around the edges of the lakes. And then we get lichens that grow on top of dried out moss. There are hairy lichens. There are orange and yellow lichens. Lichens can even grow on rocks. So you also get little orange and black spots on the rocks of lichens. And these are all growing just outside the station. We just walk outside and there they are. And Melinda, who's in the audience here, and Alison Haynes and some of the other members of the group have also been to the peninsula with me. And there are actually 2 plants with a vascular system. So most of the plants in Antarctica don't have any plumbing. And that's how they're able to freeze through the winter and survive. But this Champsia, which is this little grass, and this pearlwort, Colobanthus, they grow on the peninsula because the peninsula is a little bit warmer and they can cope with those winters over there. And you can see how extensive, though, these moss beds are. So most of this is still moss. Here's a beautiful bank of moss growing down the hill. And so mostly it's still mosses and lichens that are growing even in the peninsula. And the lichens, if you ever get to go on an Antarctic trip, you'll mostly go to the peninsula. The lichens there are incredible. I've never seen anything quite like them. Plants even grow on mountains inland. So all those images I've shown you so far are around the coast on the ice-free areas. But if we fly inland, there are mountains that poke up through that ice, and the ice could be 1, 2, 3 kilometres thick, and there's a mountain poking up through the top of it. And if you land on the top of a mountain, and I didn't do this was actually one of the helicopter pilots, if you land on one of these mountains, you find lichens, and if there's snowbanks, you actually find mosses growing on these mountain tops in this islands in a sea of ice, in the kilometres and kilometres inland from the coast in Antarctica. So really, really tough plants. And if it gets really bad, what they do is they go underneath the rock and they survive in a little greenhouse with a quartz rock on top. So what this is a rock that I've turned over that's got mosses, lichens and algae growing underneath it. When it's really windy and really cold, you're much better off if you're underneath a little rock and surviving in a little greenhouse. There's enough light coming through that quartz rock to keep the plants growing. We call those Endolithic communities. And these are just other images. So this is a beautifully large moss bank. Here's a piece of moss that's actually frozen into the edge of a lake. and we get little buttons of moss. And at Shoya Station, which is one of the Japanese stations in East Antarctica, there are moss pillars in lakes that are 2 meters high. So people go diving around these moss pillars, and they're really old, and they're underneath a layer of ice on the top of the pond, of the lake. So plants need water, and they need light, and they need nutrients. And the water comes from snow and ice. It rains very, very rarely in Antarctica. So at Casey, it might rain once a year, every other year or something, but for 5 minutes, but not very often. The water comes from the snow that's melting, and as that ice melts, the water runs over the mosses and they start to photosynthesize. But that only happens for maybe a month or 3 months through the summer. And that's the only window they've got to live to grow in. And this is actually, these bubbles are forming underneath a thin layer of ice on the top of a lake, but those bubbles are the oxygen that the plants are producing in photosynthesis. So it shows us that those plants are metabolizing happily in a water bath that's probably at about 4 degrees. And even on those summer days, in the morning, all the water will have become frozen. And I say overnight, it's not actually dark, but it still gets really cold at night. So where do the plants get their nutrients from? And this was something that we were really interested in, and we weren't sure why are the moss beds so good at Casey? What makes Casey so special? And this is a peninsula where some of the best moss beds are, and you can see these ridges of finely graded pebbles. And these pebbles, if you look at them closely, are exactly the right size for an Adelie penguin to pick them up in their beak. And I don't know if anyone's been watching any David Attenborough or the recent films that the ABC's been doing, but you often see Adelie penguins running around stealing rocks from each other's nests. They build their nests from little piles of rocks. And so 3,000 to 8,000 years ago, these ridges were full of penguins. And then as the ice has retreated and the land's bounced up again because of the weight being removed, the penguins have decided it's too far to walk, so they've moved off towards the sea, and they've left behind rocks, penguin bones, eggs, all sorts of bits of penguin, but also lots and lots of poo, lots and lots of guano, blood and bone meal for mosses. And so the mosses are actually growing on these ancient penguin colonies because the nutrients are there. Yeah, sorry, that's where the penguins are now. They're right off on those islands. From dating, we know that these penguin colonies were 8,000 years ago. This ridge was occupied 5,000 years ago, this one, and then 3,000 years ago, the one closest to the coast. And all of the great moss beds at in the Casey region, in the Windmill Islands, are found where we get the combination of water from the snow melting and these nutrient pockets that have been left there by these penguins. So it's freeze-dried plant food, an ancient freeze-dried plant food as well. So the other thing that we were really interested in when we first started working in Antarctica was how do the mosses, everyone thinks plants in Antarctica must be really cold tolerant, and they can survive those winters, but do they actually like those temperatures? And this is some work that a student who came from Spain, Alicia Pereira, did a few years ago in my lab. And we've been interested in what's the best temperature for a moss bed. And this is a typical moss bed around one of the lakes, and you can see the dark colour of the mosses. And if you imagine when the sun's on that moss is going to warm up. So if you've got a black piece of black plastic or something in the sunlight, it always warms up. We've measured the temperature of the tops of the mosses, and on a sunny day in Antarctica, when the air temperature is under 2 degrees, the moss temperature will be 25 or 30 degrees. So really, really warm. And what Alicia did, which was really amazing and very cool, was she tested what their optimum temperature was for photosynthesis, the process by which plants make their food. And she found that they were best, they did the best photosynthesis when it was over 14 degrees. So that's here on this map. So that's only on those sunny days and only for a few hours each day. And we worked out that 3% of their summer is actually optimum. So I just said they have 1 to 3 months of summer, and only 3% of it is even good conditions. So maybe think about that when I tell you how fast they grow. And even on a cloudy day, the temperature of the moss will still be about 10 degrees, but overnight it drops right down. And this isn't dark, but at 6 o'clock in the morning, the mosses will be several degrees below zero. So when I first started going to Antarctica, there was only black and white photographs. No, that's not true. But back then, the only way you could get instant or semi-instant gratification with your photographs was to have black and white film and develop it on station, because you would go down there for 3 or 4 months and there wasn't a chemist or something you could take your photos to get developed. And so people used to process the films in the darkroom on station, and black and white photography was actually really popular because that was the only things people could get in the year that they were on station. So this is me and Jane Wasley, who was the first PhD student I went down with in 1996. And you can see that it was a lot warmer in 1996. Now that's actually that we were there for 3 months and we'd got used to the cold. This is how many clothes we were wearing this year. The clothing has actually got a lot better that the Antarctic Division gives us to wear. And this is Georgia, who's in the audience, and Crystal, who came with me this season to Casey. And this is one of our favourite moss beds. And we've actually had this sign made to stop people driving over our moss beds in the winter when they're all covered in snow. So it says, "Caution, moss beds ahead." And we're thinking about getting an edition which says, "Watch out for penguins crossing." So when I first went down there, what we wanted to know was, is the ozone hole having an effect on the mosses? So back in the 90s, when I was going down at first, people were worried about the ozone hole, the increased UV, and what that would mean to plants in Antarctica. And the ozone hole appears each spring over Antarctica. And so this is 1979. And that elevated UV has increased most in Antarctica because of that ozone hole that's appearing over the spring. And so what we did was we put screens in place and we blocked out the UV from that was coming through to the plants, and we looked at how plants did if you gave them no UV or normal, took away the UV, and if you had all the UV still going through the screen. And we looked at what the difference was. And before I show you the results, I just wanted to point out that people tend to think that the ozone hole has gone away. This is October 2021. There's Antarctica underneath. And even though we agreed the Montreal Protocol as a global community, we phased out CFCs, and we are doing the most we can to save to repair the stratosphere. Those compounds that we produce, the CFCs, the refrigerants and the propellants that were produced in the before the 1979, when we discovered that ozone depletion was happening, those propellants are still in the stratosphere. They're still breaking down ozone in the summer, and it won't fully recover, or the predictions are it won't fully recover until 2060. And when people say to you, it's really important we act on climate change now, the reason for that is because there's this massive lag in the climate system. And something that we did in 1980 is still going to be affecting the planet's weather systems and climate in 2060, or until 2060. So that's why it's really important to act now and not wait. So what we discovered about the mosses, though, was that mosses do prefer not to have UV. So these are little green healthy moss shoots under a microscope. This is looking at them under a confocal microscope, and all of those little red buttons are happy little chloroplasts fluorescing away. And that's what this is what a leaf of moss should look like, and what the cells should look like. If you grow them with the normal amount of UV that was there at the stations, when we started these experiments in the 90s, you would see that they're yellow, which is an indication that the plants are producing these extra pigments because they're stressed. And so they're making antioxidant compounds and compounds that will help them to get rid of the damaging stress of ultraviolet B radiation. And if you look at these images here, there are actually cells here that have no chloroplasts. So the yellow cells have a weakly fluorescing, so their chloroplasts aren't very happy, but they do have them, whereas the black cells have no chloroplasts. So quite serious damage, but actually we also discovered that the mosses could make their own sunscreens, and many of the mosses do that quite effectively, and this is work that Melinda Waterman has led, but also started off with people like Jodie Dunn many, many years ago. And what we discovered was that the mosses make sunscreens, and also that they put them into particular places in the cell walls that plants in other places don't do. So if we look at moss from Australia and compare it with moss from Antarctica, the mosses put the sunscreens in their walls. And we think that that's a much stronger protection for them than the UV screening that the Australian varieties would have. And because of that, the ozone hole and the extra UV probably only makes a difference of about 6% to the growth rate of the mosses. So it's not, it is an effect, but it's not very large. And Mel has done a lot of work looking at the pigments that they make, where the green is healthy, happy moss that's been under a rock, and this is moss that's been exposed to full sun and probably had a bit of desiccation through the summer, and it's really bright red. And we're trying to find out what the compounds are and what triggers the plants to produce them, and what different stresses those pigments help the moss to protect itself from. And one of the questions that we always had as we, over many years, was how old are these mosses? And nobody knew. When we started going down there, nobody really knew how old the mosses were. They could have been there. Well, we knew that some of them had been there since before the station was built, but that was really all we knew. And it's very, very difficult to tell how fast a moss is growing. And we thought about 10 or 15 years ago, we thought maybe we can use radiocarbon to tell us how old the mosses are. And radiocarbon is one of the 3 isotopes of carbon. It's a very small proportion of the carbon that's in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But plants take it up, and if you look in a tree, you can find different radiocarbon signatures tracing through the rings of the tree. And what we hypothesized was that maybe our mosses could tell us what about their growth rate from this radiocarbon stored in their cells. And the reason for that is because, as I said at the beginning, mosses don't have any plumbing, so they can't move their carbon around the plant body. So the carbon's fixed here, and it can't be transported because there isn't any plumbing to transport it. And so what we thought was the bottom of the moss should be like the middle of the tree ring, and the top of the moss should be like the outside, and we should be able to cut it into little sections and go up to ANSTO and release that CO2 and then measure that carbon and see what the radiocarbon signature is. And it should tell us what year that bit of the plant was growing in. And this is made a lot easier because there's been an increase in radiocarbon in the atmosphere as a result of nuclear testing. When in the 1950s and 60s, when humans were testing nuclear weapons, there was an increase in radiocarbon. So there's this peak called the bomb pulse, and when we stopped doing atmospheric nuclear testing, it's gone down. And so because of the nuclear proliferation rules and test ban treaties and so on, there's a bomb pulse in 1965, and then it's declined since then. And now that radiocarbon signal is back down to where it was prior to that atmospheric testing. So we cut up a shoot of moss, and we were really excited because what we got was this peak recognisable as the bomb pulse. And just for your information, Casey Station was actually built in the 1970s, and the new station was built in the 80s. And so this shoot of moss was growing way before the station was built. So it's been growing there since the 1940s. This allows us to say how old is that piece of moss and how fast is it growing, and how does that growth rate change across different parts of Antarctica. And I forgot to tell you that these mosses are probably about 2 centimetres. That one I showed you was 9 centimetres, but they're not very big. So we now have mossy records of coastal climates around Antarctica. So if we look at the peninsula, the bit that I said at the beginning was warmer and it's a bit wetter, and where the other plants are growing. Those plants there are 15 to 95 years old, or younger than 15. So they're mostly younger than 100, the ones that we've measured there. But the ones over at Casey, the youngest were maybe 17 years old. But I'm going to show you one of our oldest shoots. So this is one of the endemic mosses from Antarctica. It's a specialist to Antarctica. It doesn't grow anywhere else in the world. And this is from one of our best moss beds. And this is the bomb pulse. So this is 1965, and it keeps going back down, 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 down. This one was growing in around 1600. So it's a 400-year-old moss shoot, and it's probably about that tall, about as tall as my hand. So tiny, tiny plant, but it's like an old-growth moss forest. Those plants are hundreds of years old, and they've been growing in the same place for all of that time. And this is International Glaciology Year, so this is when we actually started putting weather stations into Antarctica. And so this is important because the mosses can tell us about climates that we can't measure because we weren't recording weather down in Antarctica at the time. So now there are actually quite a lot of weather stations around Antarctica, but many of them are less than were put in after the 1960s. So the oldest ones date back to the 1960s, but many more of them are much more recent. Some of them only collect data in the summer, and so mosses are a possible source of information about coastal climates. And you might say, well, what about ice cores? But obviously at the coast, in these ice-free areas, the ice has already melted. So we can't measure the ice cores there either. So mosses might be our best bet to get that coastal climate record. So Mel's been working out how fast they grow, and it's really how slow they grow, I suppose. On the peninsula, we get growth rates for different species between 2 and 9 millimetres a year. So that's a lot of growth for a moss in Antarctica. And in East Antarctica, where it's colder, the growth rates will be 0.3 to 3 millimetres a year. So much, much less on the continent. And once we know how old the mosses are, we can also ask them how stressed they were, or what the water levels were like while they were growing. So this is another carbon isotope that we can measure. So I talked about carbon-14 for the dating. We can also use carbon-13 to tell us how wet or dry it was while the moss was growing. And from this, so far, 60% of the Antarctic moss cores from both sides of Antarctica, so from the peninsula, which is supposed to be getting warmer and wetter, and East Antarctica, 60% of them show a drying trend. And this is really worrying because some of these mosses we thought were in places where they were getting more water and should be growing faster and getting more water and enabling them to do that. And one of the things we want to do, but we haven't been able to do yet, is to combine that work that we've been doing on the pigments with the dating, so that we can look to see what sort of stress compounds the mosses are laying down in their walls. And that will actually tell us how stressed the moss was at particular periods, and will be another indication of how conditions have either got better or worse over time. And so this is a long-term monitoring system that we set up. So when we first went to Antarctica, everyone kept saying, well, so is the moss doing better or worse? And we didn't know, because nobody had ever monitored the moss. And people, monitoring sort of goes through fashion. So sometimes it's very fashionable and sometimes it's not. In 2000, we were asked by the Antarctic Division to develop a monitoring program for Antarctic mosses. And so Jane and Joanna Turnbull started to develop that and ran a pilot in 2000 as part of Jane's PhD, and then we set that up and we've been monitoring ever since. In 2003, all the little areas that we'd marked out, the quadrats that we'd marked out, were green. But when we went back in 2008, they'd gone red. They were still red in 2011 and 2012. They'd started to green up a little bit more by 2013 and 14, but if you compare this one and this one, you can still see that there's a lot of grey and red moss, indicating that the plants are stressed, even though some of the mosses are greening up again. So this is another indication that those sites are getting drier over time. But obviously, we've only been doing this since 2000, so it's less than 20 years of monitoring so far. So our long shoots give us a much better record. So this isn't just happening to the beautiful moss beds at Casey. It's also happening over at Davis Station. This is Mossel Lake. And it used to have green moss. There's the lake. It used to have moss stretching over a really large area. This is a photograph taken by someone in 1998. When we went there in 2005, it was looking like this, and we actually only found out that it used to be green by sitting on the ship and saying, look how bad this moss looks. And one of the people here, John French, had actually been there in 98, and so he showed us his pictures, and we were able to see that there'd been this massive difference. We were able to go back in 2018 and also 2021, and unfortunately, the mosses are still looking really brown and red and much more stressed than they used to be. And so this is another site that's more than 1,000 kilometres away from the sites that we're working on at Casey that's also seeing this drying. And the final piece of evidence that we have is that actually the species are changing. So we only have 3 mosses in Antarctica at Casey Station, 3 species. We had 2 that used to live in the wet zone. So one was the endemic species, the Antarctic specialist, this one here, Schistidium. And then there were these 2 globally common species. So Ceratodon you can actually get in Wollongong, and Bryum grows in places like, it will grow in Tasmania and in the Arctic. We used to get Bryum and Schistidium here, so these 2 species could grow underwater. And Jane actually did an experiment where she transplanted some Ceratodon, because we'd only ever find it up the slope here in the dry spots. She actually transplanted some into the wet zones, and it died. So we know it doesn't grow in wet sites. But when we look more recently, Ceratodon is moving into these sites because they're getting drier and so that moss is able to survive there now. And so what we need to do now is develop methods to look at this on a much bigger scale. So I said those quadrats, they're 25 by 25 centimetres. They're tiny, the ones that we've been monitoring. But with a drone, we can fly over a whole area, and it might be tens of metres long, 50 metres long, and both take images to understand the topography and the hydrology, and also put sensors on the drones that can tell us how healthy the moss is. So this is a moss health map. Blue is healthy moss, and we get all this information from those drone images as we're flying the drones over Antarctica. And we've been doing this with a group at University of Tasmania called the Terraluma Group. And this allows us to expand that to a much bigger area. We also this year put in some loggers that can measure the soil temperature and the air temperature and the moss temperature all through the winter. So we're going to be really excited to go back in November or December this year and see what the data that those loggers have been collecting is. So overall what we've been able to do is date the mosses, work out how fast they're growing, potentially develop them as climate proxies for the past climates in Antarctica. But the really bad story about it is that those moss beds seem to be drying out and dying in a lot of places, and that's a real concern. And it's a combination of ozone depletion and climate change. Ozone depletion gives us high ultraviolet radiation, but the other thing that it does is it pulls the jet stream closer to Antarctica, and it actually makes it windier and colder. And so if it's colder, there's less melt, and if it's windier, what water there is that's melted gets evaporated away more quickly. And so we think those are the drivers that are driving the drying in the moss beds. And it's not just the moss beds that are being affected. So that same shift that's occurring because of ozone depletion and climate change is what's changing the areas that are dry and wet across the southern hemisphere. So our moss beds at Casey are not doing very well, and the moss beds at Davis aren't doing very well. But trees in South America and New Zealand are also drying out and growing less well. And they have problems with hydroelectric schemes in Chile, because as that wind shifts south and takes the water into other latitudes, the water's not available for the hydroelectric schemes. So there's a whole bunch of effects of ozone depletion and climate change across the southern hemisphere that we're only just starting to understand. And then even more worrying, we thought that Antarctica was quite protected from climate change, but 2 years ago we saw a heat wave all the way around Antarctica. And Casey had a new summer record of 9.6 degrees Celsius. So I said the temperatures are normally about 1 or 2 in the summer. That was really hot. But you can see from this anomaly map that the heat was hot all around Antarctica. And it was hot for 3 months. Not 3 months solid, but it moved around Antarctica and there was a heat wave. And if you want to read more about that, there's an article in The Conversation about it that we wrote. And then just last month, this is what happened. So last month there was a heat wave in Antarctica. Overall, the whole continent was almost 5 degrees Celsius warmer than it should be. But places in Antarctica were 40 degrees warmer than they should be at this time of year. And there was a similar heat wave at the same time in the Arctic. So these are really troubling and extraordinary temperatures for Antarctica. And there's been a lot of talk in the scientific community about, nobody expected this. This was really unexpected for March, which is going into autumn, obviously, for Antarctica. And again, we've written something about that in The Conversation if you want to get more information. But the problem for us is we want to know what the plants and animals are doing when those heat waves happen. And we were there in February, and the heat wave happened in March. And the time before, we were supposed to go to Antarctica, but what happened in 2020? So we were supposed to go in February 2020, and there was a COVID pandemic, so nobody went to Antarctica. So my hope is that what we can do over the next decade or so is to develop a network of sensors around Antarctica so that we can actually get information about the mosses and the plants and the other plants and the animals in real time. And this is an Antarctic nearshore and terrestrial observing system, and the idea would be that instead of us having to go back and download the data, it would send data to satellites and we would be able to see what was happening in real time back here in Australia, but also all over the world. And this is what we envisage. So we'd like to have underwater sensors that go below the sea ice and measure what's happening on the seabed. We'd have things in our moss beds that are giving us information about the environmental conditions, but also the moss health. And they would all be transmitting back to a tower, and that would talk to the satellites through the Inari-Sat domes that they have at the stations, and that would enable us to actually get real-time data about what's happening in Antarctica. And so instead of having to wait for a year or longer, we could get information about what's happening in real time. So I'm really delighted to say that we're part of this big Antarctic Research Council initiative that involves all of these universities and partner organisations like ANSTO, the British Antarctic Survey, the Australian Antarctic Division, lots and lots of partners. But what we're trying to do is understand Antarctica's climate, what does that mean for the biodiversity, and then what should we be doing about that as environmental managers? So what should Australia be doing? What should all the other countries around the world be doing to safeguard Australia's biodiversity? And it's really important for us because if all that ice melts, it's a huge amount of sea level rise. It's 60 metres of sea level rise that is stored as water in Antarctica. So I've told you a little bit about how climate change and ozone depletion are transforming Antarctic ecosystems. That has implications for both the things in Antarctica, like the penguins and the mosses, but it also has implications for us because we see the effects of sea level rise and storm surges and extreme events and all of those things. And My main message is that, as I said with the ozone hole, we can't delay in taking climate action, because if we want to have a livable planet, we have to act now. So thank you very much. I'd like to thank my teams again. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm really happy to answer any questions.